If you ask the public today what Stoicism is, you will likely get a description of a psychological coping mechanism. It is widely understood as the practice of keeping a stiff upper lip, suppressing emotion, and gritting your teeth through the miseries of life. But treating Stoicism purely as a behavioral life hack leaves the student with a highly fragile philosophy. It reduces a vast intellectual tradition to a set of disjointed productivity tips that inevitably break down the moment real tragedy strikes. The historical reality is entirely different. Stoicism is an integrated, highly systematic theory of reality. It is a rigorous, direct evolution of classical Platonic metaphysics. To truly understand what the ancients meant by the Stoic sage, we have to abandon modern pop psychology entirely. We need to step back into the metaphysical engine room of ancient Athens and look at the actual architecture they were building. The philosophical lineage of the Stoics traces directly back to Socrates. They built their framework entirely on the foundation of his specific brand of relentless, logical inquiry. To follow their logic, we have to grasp a core concept that both Socrates and his student Plato obsessed over: techne, the ancient Greek word for the art of craftsmanship. In antiquity, techne was the domain of carpenters, potters, and sculptors, but for these philosophers, it represented something far more profound. It served as the ultimate intellectual framework for constructing a human soul. The early Stoics happily claimed the title of Socratics precisely because they believed human character could be deliberately and precisely crafted, governed by the exact same strict logic as a physical artifact. But before we can see how the Stoics forged their ethical system, we first need to understand how Plato theorized the architecture of reality itself. In the 10th book of the Republic, Plato maps out his strict hierarchy of existence using a famous thought experiment known as the allegory of the three beds. This diagram visualizes Plato's 3 layers of reality. At the very top, we have the ultimate truth, the divine form or idea of the bed. This form is created by God and exists purely as a perfect, untouchable concept. Moving down to the middle layer, we find the physical bed created by a human carpenter. This object is highly useful, but it remains an imperfect physical translation of that pure divine form above it. Finally, at the very bottom, we drop to the painter's canvas. The painter creates a crude, two-dimensional image that merely copies the look of the carpenter's physical bed. Plato assigns a specific term to this bottom layer: mimesis, or imitation. For Plato, an imitation represents a dangerous distance from the fundamental truth of the object. He deeply distrusted imitative artists because their work only captures the superficial appearance of a thing. By dealing exclusively in aesthetics, they inherently degrade the underlying reality of the original form. Plato deepens this critique earlier in the Republic, using the example of a painter trying to color a physical marble statue. He asks us to imagine a painter who decides to paint the statue's eyes purple, justifying the choice by arguing that eyes are the most beautiful part of the body, and purple is the most beautiful color. Plato points out the glaring error in this logic. Prioritizing aesthetic beauty over structural reality destroys the artwork. If the eyes are painted purple, they no longer look like eyes at all, ruining the essential truth of the object. The lesson is clear. True philosophical development requires rigorous structural integrity. You cannot build a durable ethical system by merely imitating virtue or painting a pleasing surface over a flawed character. When the Stoic school emerged, they did not reject Plato's demanding metaphysical hierarchy. Instead, they proudly integrated it into their own system. Looking at this conceptual lineage, we can see exactly which axioms the Stoics adopted from the Academy. First, they accepted the absolute priority of the soul's condition over any external physical circumstance. Second, they adopted the unity of the virtues. This is the premise that courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance are not separate traits, but one tightly interconnected cognitive system. Third, they maintained the strict equation that true virtue requires definitive structural knowledge rather than just stumbling upon a correct opinion. While the Stoics agreed entirely with Plato's critique of the deceptive painter, they realized they needed a different kind of craftsman to model their philosophy. Instead of looking down at the painter's two-dimensional canvas, the later Stoic philosopher Epictetus looked to the three-dimensional structural art of the sculptor. Epictetus grounded his analogy in the legendary master sculptor Phidias. the creator of Athens' colossal divine statues. We can map Epictetus's logic across a three-part framework. First, we identify the craftsman. For Stoicism, the craftsman is the individual philosophical student. Second, we identify the material. Where a physical sculptor uses ivory and gold, the Stoic student uses the raw data of their own cognitive impressions, how they perceive and interpret the world around them. Third, we define the final artifact. The ultimate product of this labor is the embodied sage, an invincible mind housed within a mortal body. This introduces the critical concept of immanence. For the Stoics, the divine does not exist exclusively in a separate heavenly realm. It must be actively built into the physical world. The true Stoic is never passively accepting fate. They are actively chiseling their own cognitive architecture, treating their mind as the raw ivory of a masterwork. Epictetus ultimately issued a frustrated challenge to his students who spent their time studying ethical theory without putting it into practice. In his discourses, he demands to see a Stoic fashioned like a Phidiac statue. He complains that his students can flawlessly regurgitate complex arguments from Epicurus or Plato, but completely fail to physically manifest those arguments when put under actual pressure. He contrasts the useless accumulation of theoretical scrolls with the raw endurance of the embodied soul. A structurally sound, sculpted character remains perfectly proportioned and resolute, regardless of the severe hardship battering against it. This is what makes Stoicism a distinct philosophical system. The accumulation of knowledge is completely useless unless it acts as the chisel that actively shapes human behavior. For Plato, the ultimate form of the good remains locked away in a transcendent, untouchable realm. As this diagram illustrates, the Stoics make a crucial metaphysical shift. They demand that the ideal form be brought down and realized entirely within physical matter. The ultimate achievement of Stoic metaphysics is not to intellectually comprehend the ideal blueprint in a distant reality. It is to physically become the breathing statue, the complete collapse of the ideal blueprint entirely into the building itself.